Good afternoon. I've today left hospital after a week in which the NHS has saved my life, no question. It's hard to find words to express my death.
I'm sorry if people feel that there have been failings. I'll be very, very clear about that. But at the same time, we are in an unprecedented global health pandemic right now. It is inevitable that the demand and the pressures on PPE and the demand for PPE.
If you smell what the
Kank
is cooking.
Good afternoon. It's Sunday, the 12th of April, 2020, also known as Easter Sunday here all over the world, and happy Easter to you all. My name is Umar Kankia, also known as the Kank, and welcome to the COVID-19 weekend update. Now, I've not put out an update for the last couple of days because I've just been kind of thinking about how I want to do this going forward. Now, obviously, I've just been putting out the news and the statistics, but that's something that people can get from so many different sources. So I kind of want to go a little bit different now and kind of give more of an opinion piece rather than just kind of talking about the statistics because, you know, as I said, everybody can get access to that. So as a word of warning, anyone that's a government apologist, a conservative sympathiser, anyone who thinks that the government has done no wrong, this is not going to be the video for you because I have a very different opinion on how I think this government has handled everything. First things first, we learned this afternoon actually that Boris Johnson has now come out of hospital and he is now residing in Chequers, which is his country retreat, for him to continue with his recovery. So he's out of hospital and the day-to-day government running still goes to Dominic Raab, who's the Secretary of State First Secretary of State, as well as the Foreign Secretary. So he'll continue to do that. One of the things that I wanted to remark on was the fact that I think there's been a lot of revisionist history that's been going on during this crisis. And I know a lot of people will say, we shouldn't be politicising this. You know, it's a pandemic that we're dealing with. There's a lot of things going on. You know, we should leave these kind of questions till once things have died down, etc. I don't believe that we need to wait until there's a public inquiry before we start firing the questions that need serious answers to, or at least get people's minds thinking. Because at the end of the day, we have a situation where, in my view, and a lot of people share this view as well, that we have a government who have failed in how they've dealt with this situation right from the beginning and continue to make wrong turns in how they are delivering this situation and this pandemic. Now, a lot of people are going to say, and I will openly hold my hand up and say, yes, I am a Labour supporter. I have stood for Labour in council elections. I am unashamedly a Labour Party card bearer, and I make no bones about that, and anyone that knows me knows that. And I'm not just turning this into a conservative bashing session. I'm actually wanting to do this quite constructively because I think at the end of the day, we have a Conservative government. They're the ones who've been in power for the last 10 years. So anything that I'm saying is in relation to what they, as a party, as a government, have done over the last 10 years, which I feel has contributed to the situation that we find ourselves in right now. So let me start off firstly with the beginning of all of this. So at the start, obviously we know this came from Wuhan in China. This was brought over, it became a global issue at the start of the year. So this was a problem and nobody felt the need to handle it properly. It got to Italy and, at that point I would have thought back in late January, early February, the government would have been thinking, okay, this is spreading quite fast. We need to start making plans as to how we might potentially be dealing with this should it hit our shores here in the UK. Except they didn't. They allowed certain things to continue as normal. So the Cheltenham Festival went on as normal. The Champions League match between Liverpool and Atletico Madrid, despite the fact at that point Madrid had hundreds of cases of coronavirus that had locked down the city at that stage. I know arguably people say, well, that was a UEFA decision, not a UK decision. But, I think there are ways in which we can control things. And it wasn't until we had the first few deaths in the UK that the government finally took it seriously and said, actually, we need to do something about this. Now, in my view, it shouldn't have waited until we got to the first few deaths for the government to actually pull its finger out and say, this is what we need to do. It should have been a case of saying, we recognise this is coming over quite quickly. We need to have our plans in place so that if we do have any cases here in the UK, this is how we're going to handle it. We've seen how it impacts other countries. We've seen the devastation that coronavirus has caused for so many countries in the world. Taking one example, New Zealand, they had several cases of coronavirus. They've only had one person that's died from coronavirus. But the Prime Minister there took a very swift action and said, actually, do you know what? We're locking down the borders. We're going down in full lockdown mode in the country, and we're going to contain this. 3 weeks later, New Zealand, probably I think later on this week, are planning to come out of lockdown. We are now going into our 3rd week of lockdown, and there is no signs of this abating here in the UK. And I think that is indicative of how the government have handled this. You can look back on how they've communicated things to the country. It's been more of a case of, well, you choose not to go to the pub, if you don't want to. Try not to go shopping as much if you don't want to. People are just going to ignore that. And people did. And then it was the case of the government saying, actually, we're going to stop you going to pubs and restaurants and bars, and we're going to stop that. It should never have been left as a choice for us to make as people, because naturally a lot of people are going to rebel against that, and actually if it's not written down in stone, people are just going to be like, well, whatever, we've been told it's guidance, we don't need to really follow it, and that's exactly what happened. So government failed on that respect. Then you have a situation where we have now gone into lockdown, but the NHS is woefully underfunded to deal with this situation. Now, people are going to say, well, NHS has never had to deal with something like this before. And yes, you're right, they never have had to deal with something like this before. But we're also in a situation where we've had a government running campaigns last year during the general election saying that we're going to increase the number of nurses in the NHS to up to 50,000. But ironically, they're the ones that cut the number of nurses that have been in the NHS over the last 10 years. So, people want to look at revisionist history and start saying, well, we're in this situation. Well, no, this government was responsible for the underfunding of NHS for a very long time. I know people are going to point back to Labour and kind of part privatisation of the NHS and whatnot, and I accept that. But the bottom line is we've had a Conservative or a coalition government for the last 10 years. They're the ones who continue to cut funding to the NHS. This is the same party, the same government who voted against pay rises for nurses in the NHS and actually were cheering about it. And I frankly thought that was disgusting at that time. Then you have a situation where doctors and nurses on the front line are dying because of the lack of PPE equipment that's been issued to them. Yet we've had, over the last 24 hours, Home Secretary, Health Secretary, Business Secretary saying to us, the public, I'm sorry if you feel that that's the way it's been handled, and not actually issuing a proper apology. You as a government have failed to provide the necessary equipment for our nurses and our doctors to be able to handle this situation properly. You as a government have continued to undercut the NHS for years and years and years, and you've had to rely on people coming back in their thousands from early retirement, from those who've been retired for many years, and actually having to do a drive where we've had 750,000 people across the country who've signed up as volunteers to assist in this situation. We should never have to be in this situation in the first place, and the failing goes on the government and how they've dealt with this. One thing that I think is interesting is that Boris Johnson has made it quite clear that he owes his life to the NHS, and that is good and well. And I think those platitudes, of course, when you've been faced with a life and death situation, a lot of things can get said after the event. For me, what I think is it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out once this crisis is over. You owe your life to the NHS. Yes, you do. There's no question about that. About the NHS, God knows what would have happened to the Prime Minister. But you need to put your money where your mouth is. There's no point saying you owe your life to the NHS, and then when we come back, when Parliament gets back to normal, and when the country starts getting back to normal, nurses get forgotten about, and they get put to the scrap heap once again because you feel like they've done their duty. We want to see a commitment from this government to ensure that nurses get the pay rises that they deserve, the NHS starts to get the funding that it deserves, and that we're never left in a situation where something like this happens and we're too slow to get off the mark in how we deal with this situation. So for anyone that thinks, well, actually, it's all good, the government have done what they've been able to do, they've handled the situation in the best way that they can. If you want to think that, that's up to you. I don't think so. I don't personally believe that the government have handled this in the best way possible. They've had the information, they've seen how other countries have done it, they've just been very slow. And in some situations quite arrogant in how they've dealt with this pandemic. So I hope that the government are held to account whenever there is a public inquiry as to the handling of the situation, that they do not just accept, people don't just try and pretend that stuff like this was not happening. And a final words to a couple of people. One, to journalists, you guys need to really put the government to account on these daily briefings, because I'm getting sick to death, I'm sure a lot of people are, of seeing the same old weak lines being trotted out day in, day out. People aren't asking the proper questions. We should not be afraid. We live in a society where it's free press, and we should not be afraid to be putting our views and our opinions forward and actually asking those tough questions of the government, regardless of that timing. And the same thing with the Labour Party. We've got a new leader in Keir Starmer, and I'm seeing that he's making a lot of noise and a lot of the right information that's going out there. And, it's great to see that. But I really hope that the Labour Party do, and other opposition parties as well, start to press together and start putting the government to account. And that starts with Parliament resuming sooner rather than later. Enjoy the rest of your Easter, and I'll catch up with you guys in a week. Thanks.
Thank you very much for listening to my COVID-19 daily update. Remember, in these important times, we need to stay at home, we need to look after ourselves, look after our own well-being. And as the UK government have said, stay at home, protect the NHS, save lives. And that's the bottom line, because the Kank said so.